Hello everyone, Chris Martinson, CEO of Peak Prosperity here with your video update. I'd like to say weekly, but I skip weeks every so often. It is Friday, November 16th, 2018, and well, we have a lot to talk about. I just got back recently, yesterday actually, during a snowstorm here on the East Coast from Ottawa, where I was presenting to a real estate group. About 220 people or so, I think, showed up, and I gave a talk, and I did my usual thing, where trying to connect a few dots and showing that economy, energy, environment, all on these unsustainable trajectories. But since it's a real estate crowd, I like to focus things for my crowd when possible. And there's a misconception out there that I'd like to see if we can help shed some light on. As you know, Peak Prosperity, we're a learning organization. We're all about learning. And if we can educate ourselves and we can really understand where we are, we have a much better chance of knowing what to do, what actions to take, and in order to make our lives as rich, as happy, as fulfilling, as prosperous as we can. Now, the misconception I would like to talk about is this idea that there was a housing bubble that was very destructive in 2008. There was, but it's a little bit of a misconception. What the additional framing I'd like to put around this is to note that it was really a side bubble on the edge of a much, much, much larger bubble. I'm a huge critic of what the central banks have been up to. I think Alan Greenspan was the beginning of the end for this concept of reasonable central banking, if there ever was such a thing. And what he did was he committed a number of grievous sins, all of them rooted in intellectual failings. There was some profound, some less profound, but one, he thought risk could be eliminated, that derivatives somehow eliminated risk. They don't. They spread it, but they also concentrate it, depending on how it goes. Two, this big error. He decided to do away with the business cycle, replacing it with a credit cycle, under this ridiculous idea that somehow a small group of unelected officials could decide what was the right price for money and markets, and whether, how much unemployment or employment there ought to be, and like that they ought to be able to figure all this stuff out, which means fundamentally they don't trust that the markets can work things out for themselves. So what happened under this theory? Well, politicians loved it because it meant we could just borrow more and more and more and push it off into the future. So this led to the largest bubble in all of human history, but it didn't start last week. It didn't start 10 years ago. It didn't even start 20 years ago. To really get to the headwaters of the Nile here, we have to note where the borrowing really began to exceed the income. Now, again, I don't care how much debt is on the books, but I do care relative to income. Is $10 million a lot of debt to me? You bet. Is it a lot to Bill Gates? Nah, not really. So debt to income, that's what matters. Now, in this story, as a nation or as a globe, GDP, gross domestic product, it's a really poor measure. It fails on a lot of fronts. It's the only one we got, so we'll use it. But let's pretend that gross domestic product, or GDP, is the same as talking about our income. Again, not quite right, but good enough for now. All right. So if that's our income, then debts should stay in proportion with that income. And that was true in the United States all through its history. Up until about 1985 or so, things really began to go off the rails there. And in 1987, we had this crash. Greenspan comes on board, and then things really went off the rails at that point, because he started doing some really outrageous things with the Federal Reserve that should have been talked about, should have been debated, should have been rejected, but weren't. Fast forward, here we are. So first chart I want to share with you, it's this one. Jason's going to pull this up so you can see it in more detail. Top line, we're looking at the total amount of debt in the United States, and on the bottom line, we're looking at the gross domestic product of the United States. Now, I think you can see that whatever relationship exists between those two lines, it broke down a long time ago. Some might date it to August 15th, 1971, and coming off the gold standard. But really, it was a long-term departure in sound economic theory, sound financial theory, which isn't that hard to understand. Listen, folks, you don't need a PhD in anything, let alone economics, to understand that if your debts are growing faster than your income, someday you have a math problem. Now, Second thing I want you to notice on the chart is that little wiggle that exists there. Jason, give a circle on that, would you? That little wiggle that happens right there around 2008. That's the first time in this data series that credit actually went backwards, and that's what almost destroyed the world's banking system. It got so addicted to this idea of growing credit, not just a little bit faster, but compounding. And I'm using that term very carefully, compounding at twice the underlying rate of the income. So if debts were compounding at close to 9%, GDP was growing, or income was going at maybe 4%. This is astonishing. You can't compound your debts faster than your income forever. Well, that first hiccup that roared there in 2008, when we saw credit markets go in reverse for just a tiny bit of time, and that almost destroyed the system again, that was a shot across the bow that should have said, hey, we really have to stop this. In fact, the first shot I would submit to you was in 1994. Little hiccup in the corporate credit markets. Greenspan freaked out, eliminated the reserve requirements for the banks through this complicated thing called the sweeps program. You should check that out. If I've written about it, it's a fabulous crime scene story. If you're into true detective novels. 1994, then 1998, another hiccup. Again, the Fed came in and rescued after the long-term capital management, or LTCM, fiasco. And then 2000 happened, and 2001, that whole breakdown. And of course, that's when the Federal Reserve stepped in again. And then we had the housing bubble, and then they stepped in again. So we had multiple shots across the bow. And so here we are today, right? And we now have the largest credit cycle bubble top in all of human history. But again, it began in the mid-1980s, late 70s, early 80s. We'll date it back there somewhere, okay? So the housing bubble then was really just a side bubble that couldn't have existed outside of the larger credit bubble that had been happening for a long time. And when you get bubbles, you get a couple of enduring features from them. The first is that in order to have a bubble, you need two things. One, you need a good story that people can believe in. It was tulip bulbs once, it was railroads at another time, it was swampland in Florida at different times, it was internet stocks, whatever it is, you need a story, and you need ample credit. You can't have a bubble without credit. Why? Because here's the definition of a bubble. A bubble exists when asset prices rise beyond what incomes can sustain. Well, how do you get asset prices higher than incomes? That's where the credit comes in. So you need a lot of credit, and that's why it was a huge, huge error for Alan Greenspan to say, I can do away with the business cycle, as if this was some sort of white knight awesome thing he was doing, and I'll replace it with the credit cycle. Oh my God, what a terrible idea this was. And shame on everybody at the Fed who went along with this, thinking it was some maestro-like activity. But I guess, if you're working at the Fed, it must be fun. People love you, especially at Davos and in the halls of power during the upcycle of the credit cycle. And on the way down, when everything's breaking and exploding, you get to be the white knight again and ride in, and you're the rescuer. So you're both like, you're the arsonist that sets the fire and the volunteer fireman who puts it out. And people love you for some reason in both of those roles. It's a mystery. We really need some more education about the Fed and what they're up to and its destructive effect on your life. So let's look now at where we are, though, in terms of the business cycle versus the credit cycle, and why I think, and why I wrote recently that I'm a perma-bear, and why I think we have to be watching incomes really, really closely in this story, which is the subject of a piece of writing that's coming out later today, Friday, November 16th. It's about incomes, written by Adam Taggart. So, Jason, let's pull now up this second chart. I want to show you here GE, that's right, General Electric, one of the largest companies, has produced some of the most actual valuable stuff in the world, turbines and, actual stuff. Not as fun as being a hedge fund operator where you go out and you make billions by, skimming off the top and producing nothing. But GE is a productive company, or are they in trouble? Look at this chart. So first up, we see bubble one back there in 2000. GE was right alongside, step for step, tick for tick, with the larger markets. GE in that pink or red line. I got pink on my little hand-drawn chart here, but it's going to probably show up as red on the chart you're looking at when we pull that up. And then also bubble two in 2000. We look at that second peak right there. And then look at this right here. This is GE. It's absolutely cratering right here. This is, the bonds of this company, $110 billion worth of bonds, about to get downgraded to junk territory. A little late. Those should have been downgraded a year ago. Don't trust the credit rating agencies. Why didn't we learn that lesson the last 3 times, right? Don't know. Big mystery. But here's the S&P, just merrily still. I know it's been more volatile lately, but it's just trundling along as if this doesn't matter at all, as if one of the largest diversified industrial manufacturing concerns in the United States history even doesn't matter anymore. So I think that the S&P and the other U.S. stock indexes at this point are still heavily overvalued. I think there's a large set of reckonings that have to come. But again, it's not really the price of the stocks that's a concern here. It's the fact that, and I'm going to go back to this one now, that the United States has been on this credit binge for a very long time, where what we've been doing is constantly increasing the amount of debt we have relative to income. If you're constantly increasing the debts you have and your income isn't increasing as fast, sooner or later, this is a math problem. That math problem arose in 1994, again in 1998, again in 2000, 2008, and every single time the Fed's response has been to double down, triple down, quadruple down, and here we are. So that's why you have to be watching for these things very carefully. That's why we're primarily an educational organization at Peak Prosperity. You have to know this stuff. If you're in there competing in the arena for money and you're trying to save your money in that arena, but you don't know the role of the Federal Reserve in deforming that arena, if you don't understand what that arena is made from, if you don't understand money creation and mechanisms of banking and how credit cycles work versus business cycles, you're going to get blindsided. And there's no excuse for being blindsided in this day and age. This information is right here. It's freely available. You need to be curious to go out and get it. A lot of people aren't curious, or at least as curious as they ought to be at this point. So this is fascinating. And by the way, this is the next crime scene that's right here. This crime scene is being put forward by the banks right now and the Federal Reserve, and it's coming. It's coming to a crash. It will come down at some point, collapse, crash, decline, bear market, whatever you want to call it. But it's what happens when you print way too much money compared to the real stuff in life. There always has to be a balance between these things. If GDP is real stuff and the money and the stock price is rising and bond prices rising are the claims, and more debts and IOUs and unfunded liabilities and all that stuff happens, these always correct at some point. The hope is that GDP will spike and we'll get really rapid growth, but that hasn't happened for 15 years now, and it doesn't happen, as Reinhardt and Rogoff showed, because of the role of debt alone. If that was all there was, I think we could get through this in different circumstances, but the resources aren't there to create the kind of growth we needed before. It's just a whole different world. The Federal Reserve is playing hockey with rules from 200 years ago. There's a totally different game on the ice today. So that's it for today. Watch the markets as carefully as you can. It's cracking. Something's got to give here sooner or later. You hear all those creaking and groaning noises. For my money, unless and until the central banks come back in and print a ton more money and throw it into the markets, we're going to see a lot more volatility. We're going to start to see some downside that's really going to accelerate. Hasn't quite arrived yet, but it will. And if GE is any indication, we're going to be seeing that happening sooner than later. It's really impossible for me to think that the US S&P can completely ignore something as dramatic as a company as large as General Electric suffering such a severe set of circumstances as it's experiencing right now. So with that, I'm Chris Martenson. I will see you next time.